Hello and welcome to Training Bytes. My name is Mike Gibb from accountsrecovery.net, and with me again is Mary Shores from Mary Shores Communication, who is here to offer more great insight and advice. To tell you a little bit about Mary, Mary Shores is a second-generation agency owner, best-selling author, and creator of the Collection Advantage online program, which is designed to help collectors create and execute high-converting scripting that increases your cash flow and decreases complaints. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that people outside the industry never think happens, and that is how to end a call with a thank you from a consumer. I know we all want this, Mary, so please start filling us in.
Hey, Mike, it's great to see you again today, and we're going to talk about one of my very favorite topics, which is how to get a thank you at the end of that call. There is nothing more that would brighten my day than when I get an email from my office manager that says we've received a thank you from a consumer. And so we actually get those very, very often. So the first tip in getting a thank you is understanding basic human needs. So every person has a set of basic human needs, and the number one need is to feel heard and understood. So what I mean by that is sometimes the consumer is talking and the consumer is saying things that might be reasons that they don't want to pay the bill or that they don't feel like they can pay the bill. It's very important at that point for the collector to really pause and listen to everything the consumer has to say. Because if we can listen and then we can acknowledge through a validation that we've heard them, it allows the consumer to move the call forward. Now, what happens often is the collector will interrupt the consumer, or the collector will not acknowledge what they've just heard. So, Mike, have you ever been on the phone with somebody and they start telling you a really long story?
Oh, yes, all the time. Usually I'm the one telling it, but more often, sometimes it happens where the other person does it.
Right. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but have you ever been on a call with someone and they're telling you a really long story, and then when you get that opportunity to sort of redirect the conversation, next thing you know, they went and started that story over from the beginning?
Sure, absolutely. One of my great pet peeves.
Mine too. So therein lies the problem we need to solve. So why does that happen? It's because when the consumer feels like they have not checked the box in their mind that they have been heard, they will start that story over from the beginning. And what's even worse is they will start adding more details because they think that you're not listening to them, or they think you don't understand them. So remember that the number one human need is to feel heard and understood. And the way to make sure that the person can check the box in their mind that they've been heard and understood is to not interrupt. We need to listen without an interruption. We need to listen without judgment and listen without the but. And then when you acknowledge what they've just said, don't make this mistake, which is to say, I understand, but we need to talk about this debt. That will kill the conversation and move us into my next tip, which is understanding what creates conflict versus what creates connection. So, Mike,
Yes.
tell me, have you ever been on a call, maybe with somebody in customer service, or you're talking to someone on the phone, and the whole point of the call was you were looking for help, but by the end of the call, you were just completely frustrated?
Sure, all the time. You have these conversations and they don't go anywhere, or they don't go in the direction you need them to, or you don't get the resolution you're looking for. Absolutely. Happens all the time.
Right. It's the most frustrating thing. So in 2005, when I first began to create the program, which is now known as the Collection Advantage program, one of the first, really what happened was I was having these daily stressful phone calls in my agency. And I just noticed how people would, the call would start one way, and at some point it would blow up. So there was a lot of conflict, and I now call that the conflict zone. So in order to stay out of the complex zone and get us into the connection zone, it was really important to start studying and understanding the things that put us into the complex zone in the first place. So we've already talked about the number one human need is to feel heard and understood. When someone doesn't feel heard and understood, it immediately moves them into having negative feelings. Now, I just want to give you some examples of what can cause these negative feelings. So one of the first things is when we don't provide the consumer with alternative solutions. So if we don't provide the consumer with alternative solutions, then that is going to feel to them like we're being demanding. Okay, and that will cause conflict. Now, the next thing is oftentimes, and none of this is ever intentional on the part of the collector. So inadvertently, a collector can start a disagreement or engage in a disagreement that next thing you know, it's like you've got two people in a boxing ring and they've both got their boxing gloves on. And so once those negative feelings begin to establish, what happens is the consumer goes into this conflict zone. It's really difficult to recover the conversation once it's in the conflict zone. What we want to do is reverse that. We want to reverse that and put them into the connection zone. So the first step in doing that, remember, is to make sure they feel heard and understood. Outside of that, it's where and how can we eliminate negative language from the call? Because negative words plant a seed of a negative outcome, and this is really important to understand. So words like no, not, can't, won't, and however, especially the word unfortunately. So the word unfortunately is the number one offender, and I recommend that you remove the word unfortunately from your talk-offs. It will make a huge difference. Outside of that, sometimes we can, as collectors, come across as lecturing or reciting policy. So I don't know about you, Mike, but have you ever been on the phone with a customer service representative or in any kind of situation where them explaining their policy to you really in your mind made you feel better or that you thanked them for that?
Off the top of my head, no. And recounting the last time it happened, which was just a few days ago, definitely not.
Definitely not. And what made it a definitely not?
Well, I was asking I needed a favor. I needed somebody to kind of go above and beyond what their product was supposed to offer, what I was paying for, willing to do more to get that. But their box said that I couldn't do what I was asking, and they refused to do it. And they just kind of kept repeating their policy.
Right. And then repeating the policy again and again, when we do that, which I've heard a lot of collectors doing that, what happens is the consumer is just going to get more and more and more frustrated. Well, the more frustrated they get, the less likely they actually are to make payment. Sure. Did you know that people are 6 times more likely to make a deal with someone if they actually like them?
I did not, but that totally makes sense.
Right. So the way we do that is we need to start behaving in ways that are going to create connection. We can do that by, always talking in terms of solutions and next steps. So if someone listens to you and understands you and says, Mike, what we can do for you is, because even if they couldn't check that box, that's within that policy, there is always something that can be done. Sure. And what I think is we spend a lot of time focusing on what we can't do instead of focusing on what we can do. The next part of this is, I've already said that negative words plant a seed of a negative outcome. So on the flip side, positive words plant a seed of a positive outcome. So when we frame our offer using positive language, like you might be interested in knowing that ... just fill in the blanks. Remember to always make the consumer feel heard and understood. How's that sound to you, Mike?
That sounds like it would lead to a lot of positive conversations.
Mm. And the last tip that I really want to give about this is understanding the difference you can make when you can get a little bit into the mind of the consumer. So I'm going to share with you 3 quick things that consumers wish you knew about them. The first one is that just like us, consumers have fears. So they definitely have a fear of poverty. They have a fear of getting sick, especially now with, COVID situation. People have a lot of these fears. And right now, there's also a lot of uncertainty happening. Another one is that just like you, consumers want to survive and thrive. And consumers will look at us. And if you are someone who's going to help them survive and thrive, they will see you as an ally. Versus if you are someone who's going to, say, interrupt their ability to survive and thrive, they will see you as the enemy. And the last thing is, if you can just understand that consumers in their own way, they're always doing the best we can. Each and every one of us, we wake up in the morning and we think to ourselves, or maybe we don't actually have this thought, but in general, people are really doing the best they can with what they have right now.
So how do you take that, the consumer wants to pay their, they've picked up the phone and made the call, or they've answered the phone when you've made the call. How do you, it seems to me like that starts with an attempt at a connection and not necessarily a conflict. So how do you kind of make sure that the call stays in that zone? It doesn't, sort of veer off in the wrong direction and end up, where it's more confrontational than it should be.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. I think that what's involved here is really understanding that the way to begin to solve these kind of issues in the industry begins with developing collectors who understand how to put together a conversation that leads to an agreement. So I feel like that starts foundationally with training on things like communication training, critical thinking training, and negotiation training. It really boils down to this, Mike. The way we've been conditioned to speak is the opposite of what will work to collect payment.
Well, I know I'm not supposed to use this word, but unfortunately, we've run out of time for today's episode. And I'm not ashamed to use that word because this was another great conversation, Mary. Thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of Training Bytes. Definitely will look forward to our next episode, which will be coming shortly.
Wonderful. I can't wait.